Okay, I am with Dr. Peter Osborne, who I had a very interesting conversation with at an event not too long ago. We just started talking about gluten and grains and all the kind of stuff that's out there in the popular media. And he's done his homework, and it was really eye-opening to have a conversation with someone who's just got such deep domain expertise in this. And I said, man, you got to get on the show. We got to talk about this with everybody, because this is something I didn't know, and I kick around in these circles, so I'm sure you're going to get a lot out of this. Dr. Peter Osborne, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here and chat with you. Thanks.
Yeah, great. So you have a book coming up in November. I know you've been doing a ton of research on the subject, and it's about grains and pain. So what's the working title now?
Yeah, it's No Grain, No Pain.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure you kept that one. No grain, no pain. And I actually have a personal experience with this. Done all these tests and was like, you're fine with gluten. But then I realized that my hip and my back and my neck and all the weird orthopedic stuff that starts to creep up in your 30s and definitely show up when you turn 40, it's worse when I have gluten. And I just, it's like the blood test didn't say so, but my body did. And so I started to scratch my head and wonder about this stuff. And your conversation with me was very enlightening. And so let's get into gluten being what it is and grains as a class. And let's just start circling around why maybe our bodies don't like this stuff.
Well, there's, depending on who you read and what research you go to, there's some recent studies that have been put out by Alessio Fasano at Harvard showing that, no matter who you are, whether you have a true, allergy, sensitivity, and tolerance to gluten, that you're going to react in such a manner where it creates an intestinal permeability when you ingest enough of it. So, that being said, in and of itself, is gluten a healthy thing for humans to eat? I think is the question that we might, ponder or pose. But I like to even go deeper than that, because I believe that humans can evolve and adapt to the environment and adapt to eating certain things. Certainly, you can look at cultures all over the world and see some cultures, consume very, very different foods than what we consume here in the U.S. and thrive. There have been cultures studied that consume dairy as a staple and they thrive. There have been cultures studied that consume fat as a staple and thrive, meat as a staple and thrive. So I'm beyond saying that no one should eat gluten, although I know, even though I have Gluten-Free Society as my, as my foundation, and I'm pretty anti-grain in terms of my stance, but I am only that way for those who need to be that way. And so what you mentioned a minute ago, which is, your tests came back, they were normal, told you were fine with gluten. And so kind of what I like to do is refine the way that we even go into trying to make this diagnosis and identify who genetically should or shouldn't be eating grain, because there's a handful of genes that we can look at that will help us to identify whether or not when you consume gluten, you're going to have a negative or a positive reaction to it. And it's genetic. And so we tend to try to disease classify everything, right, with our, all of our numbers, ICD-9 and ICD-10 codes. Mainly, I think classification exists, one, for science, and two, for determining what medication. But if we look at, the classification of gluten sensitivity, having a sensitivity to something does not necessarily dictate disease, but having a sensitivity and continuing the consumption to the point where we have chronic inflammation turns into disease. And so if we wait for that point, now we're treating disease with drugs instead of actually stopping the inflammation with changes in diet.
We talked about loss of oral tolerance with Dr. Tom O'Brien in a previous interview, and it was really interesting. It's like, what's the straw that breaks the camel's back? And with gluten, it just gets to the point where the body's like, okay, uncle, I can't take this anymore, and now this is becoming a leaky gut issue. This is now crossing over, my immune system is jumping in and saying, look, now it's a problem, and we have to develop antibodies. And there's a pretty clear arc. I mean, we start getting into autoimmune disease, we start getting into all kinds of nasty stuff that happens at that point. So I guess the first question to hammer in on here is it the gluten? I mean, when we're talking about no grains, I mean, there's other grains that technically are gluten-free, and that's arguable as well, but is it the actual gluten? Is there something else in grains that are also causing this, or is it compounding it? What are you seeing?
All the above. So that's a great question, really. Gluten is, if we look at the history of the definition of what gluten is, medically speaking, it was really defined in 1952 as something called alpha gliadin, which is this set of protein structures found within wheat, barley, and rye. And so that's really when people are referring to gluten, that's really medically what they're referring to. But if we really ask the question what gluten is the name of a family of storage proteins found within all seeds of grass. So we have, wheat and barley and rye and oats and sorghum and millet and teff and triticale and rice and corn, all being seeds of grass. And if we look even deeper than gluten, so we have different glutens in these different grains, and we have a lot of studies that show that these different glutens create inflammatory responses, especially with corn. And corn is one of the largest gluten-free grain selling products available. You can get corn pastas and corn breads and a number of other corn-based products. And so what I've seen in my own practice clinically, and a number of other physicians have seen this as well, is that getting a patient off of traditional gluten, wheat, barley, and rye is oftentimes enough to make them feel better, but not oftentimes enough to make them recover. So they still have persistent health issues. They still have persistent problems. And one of the reasons why is they're still getting a healthy dose of gluten-based proteins found within the corn and as well as within rice. But even beyond gluten, Pedram, you've got gluten, but then you've got several other classes of proteins that are non-gluten proteins. One in particular that was recently discovered within probably about the last 20 years, called ATIs, amylase trypsin inhibitors. And what these proteins have been discovered to do is they've been discovered to shut down pancreatic secretion. So they actually inhibit pancreatic function. And so you get this person who's using all this gluten-based protein and food-based products in their diet as a staple food. All the meantime, they're shutting down the ability of their body to be able to even digest it while they're creating leaky gut. So we have this, intestinal permeability coinciding with this inability to digest. And now, as you said before, that that proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back, at what point do we actually lose the ability to continue to adapt to the environment without being ill? And this is kind of that magic scenario where the gut now breaks down. And so no matter what we eat, we start to react to it. But in addition to that, what we're eating is not being properly broken down. So the body can't get the nourishment that it needs to be able to repair and heal and grow. So we're kind of in this catch-22 scenario where, yeah, you can remove the traditional glutens from the diet. You're not going to get fully better. Studies prove this. Many studies show that up to 92% of people on this traditional gluten-free diet don't recover. That's a large percentage. And the recovery, the way it was measured, was intestinal inflammation, not symptomatic resolution, but intestinal inflammation. Because as you know, we have silent celiac disease. A person can be silent for 30 or 40 years and then one day wake up and get a diagnosis of lymphoma as the way that gluten sensitivity manifests in them. And we don't want anybody to have to wait to that point where the silence breaks and now we have a terminal case.
Let's back this up just a quick second, because the ATIs seem pretty aggressive, right? And so let's go back to what this means in botany. And this is the conversation you and I had about this was really great. I love how you're almost like an investigative journalist doctor, where you're like, well, what the hell is this and why? And so you start going in and start talking to some botanists about it, saying, well, what is this stuff? So what is this stuff to the grass, and why is it that we are having such a reaction to it? Why are these chemicals even there? I thought that this was a pretty intriguing piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, so if we really evaluate what is the purpose, of these seeds, and we could say this about any seed, but particularly with gluten, we're talking about grain, the seeds of grass. There are a number of different chemical proteins found within seeds. Gluten is just one family of them. There are several others. We've discovered 5 different classes at this point that can shut down digestion, create inflammation, and pose challenges to the gastrointestinal tract. And if we think about it, from an evolutionary perspective, what what we see in grain is they're seeds. And so seeds are designed to perpetuate the species, so to speak, right? Their job is not to be consumed by predators and fall to the dust, right? Their job is to maintain a degree of protection of their own species so that it continue to flourish and continue to grow. And so what humans have done is we've cultivated these grains. We've made them survive even better through hybridization, through genetic manipulation, through exposure to pesticides, so that their genes have become better at surviving, right? And now we've made all these really, really ultra survivors part of our staple food. And so here we're putting in chemicals into our body that have this uncanny ability to survive because their purpose is not to be human food, but it's to perpetuate their own species. And that ultimately and fundamentally is where I kind of fall on the grain premise. Is why would we consume a food as a staple that's designed to survive human digestion? Because ultimately and eventually it's going to catch up to you if you're consuming that on a regular basis, and then you add all the other processed foods and all the other garbage and all the other unhealthy lifestyle factors that people take common practices in. Lack of sleep, too much stress, not enough sunshine, not getting in the dirt and digging around with their hands, all these things that cause immune problems, that cause digestive problems. And so we have a staple food, a core staple food within our society that's designed to survive our digestion. And then now we kind of scratch our heads and wonder why so many people are sick. You can ask anybody that we've talked to, and you included. I know you have a wonderful following and a wonderful podcast that educates so many people. But of all the doctors that you've ever talked to, I'm sure you'll come to that same conclusion, that one of the first pieces of advice that the vast majority of these doctors give for chronic disease and chronic autoimmunity is first cut out gluten. And secondarily to that, they say don't go to the gluten-free aisle and buy all these gluten-free processed foods, because you're not going to find health in those particular packages.
That's the challenge, right? Is okay, so now what do I eat? Like I grew up with a Middle Eastern background, right? It's like bread and cheese every morning. So all of a sudden it's just like, well, you just took away everything I know. And it's a shock to the system for a lot of people who just really, it's the fundamentals of who we are and the cultures we come from and how we come together and how we break bread and all these types of things that are kind of built into the foundation of our cultures. Like, you just took that away from me. And so now I'm walking around like a zombie in the grocery store wondering what the heck I can eat. And it's one of the biggest challenges we have as functional medicine docs is being able to turn that corner and offer hope and also offer options for lunch. Because if you don't do that, you're in trouble. So I want to see if I can wrap my brain around this and just put a synopsis on what our last point was real quickly. Is the plants, the grasses in particular, are producing substances to protect the seeds so dumb animals don't eat them, and they go on and create more grasses. And what we've done is said, oh, we like those seeds, and we start accelerating their production and enhancing their growth so that we're getting more of the stuff the plant creates to fend off or ward off the consumption of these seeds by animals. And now we're eating more and more of it. So it's like we're eating glue, and eating glue that specifically has substances in it that are designed to shut down our digestion. And that's what we're calling food. Is that relatively accurate?
It's right on the money.
That's nuts. That's absolutely nuts. The fact that the staple diet that we have in our society is something that's specifically designed to say, don't eat me, by the plant kingdom.
I think that's the double-edged, blade of success. In order to advance civilization and technology and make life easier, we needed a source of food. Obviously, if we're hunting all the time, we don't have the time to think and ponder and make life better. And so farming and agriculture in and of itself has provided us with the ability to make life easier, but at the same token, it's provided us with chronic degenerative disease. So where then do you draw a line? Where do you back up and say, how can we continue to farm and have agriculture that drives a healthy community as opposed to a very unhealthy community, so that we can live in the best of both worlds? And I like what you said a minute ago when you said, with your background, bread and cheese, and you said you've just taken away those things, and what am I going to do? Well, I like to reverse engineer that in somebody's mind as much as we can and say, instead of taking away those things, what I've just done is I've given you back your ability to walk without pain. I've given you back your ability to not have headaches 4 out of 7 days this week. I've given you back the ability to not suffer with irritable bowel syndrome or dementia and brain fog or any of the other vast numbers of medical conditions that we know that gluten and grain can cause. And if we spend a little bit of time revamping your menu and educating you on other foods and other variety of foods and options that you might have, then now we have the best of both of those worlds. And really, that's what it's all about. A lot of people look at me and say, you're such a food Nazi, because they don't understand it. They don't see what I see every day in my practice, or maybe they're not sick enough in their own life to really be able to appreciate what diet change can do and accomplish for somebody who's chronically ill. But I like to look at it more as empowering a person to maintain and well, first to restore their health, and then secondary to that, to maintain their health.
One of the things that you said that I think is a powerful unlock in this is that people will go gluten-free, but still be taking corn, still be taking certain grains, still be taking certain substances. So it's kind of like a alcoholic in AA still having a drink or two here and there and wondering why they still have a problem. So it's like all this orthorexia is also a misread, because if you're to do it and do it right, then you're going to feel so good, you're going to be doing so much better, then it's just self-evident why you're doing it and you just keep doing it. But if you only do it half-assed, then you're still going to have symptoms, you're going to kind of slightly be better, and then you're still stuck. So I'm assuming part of this is that people are just not doing this correctly and kind of going from point A all the way alpha to omega here and making sure that they've cleared it so that they do have the enhanced health benefits. Because the inflammation, at the end of the day, some symptoms being gone is one thing, but when the inflammation drops, then all of a sudden the body can be happy and go about its business again, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the end result is that we're trying to stop this. I call it the grainflammation cycle, where when you put in food that creates inflammation, and inflammation is, let me just kind of say that inflammation is a normal body process. We all need it. But it's when there's too much present that our body deteriorates faster than it can repair. And that's when things break down. That's when we lose our resiliency. And so if we can get a better handle on that inflammation by changing the nature of the way we eat, many people feel almost like we've taken everything away and that we no longer have variety in the diet. But I would say just think of your variety as not being cereal, pasta, breads, crackers, and all the different byproducts from grain. Think of your variety as being all the different varieties of fruits and vegetables and different meats and things of that nature that you can consume, because most people really don't have variety in their diet at all. They have sameness of 2 or 3 different types of food mashed and formed in different aspects to give them texture variety and to give them taste variety, but not necessarily to give them nutritional variety, which is ultimately what we want to try to achieve. And that generally, for most people starting on this process, there's a 10 to 12 week learning curve. And so, grabbing somebody, holding them, walking them through it, kind of holding them by the hand and saying, look, first do this, second do this, third do this. Don't sweat the small stuff in the beginning. Let's just get you to a point where we can kind of move to the next evolution of changing your diet, as opposed to being paralyzed with inaction because it's so overwhelming.
Yeah, and so I see a couple pieces here. One is obviously society and industry and civilization, and I'm not like, trying to gun for Big Brother over here. I mean, we got really good at making food, and people starved to death, and that's better, right? And so we've made a lot of advancements, but in that, it seems like we started to refine and accelerate the use of certain substances that are a little too much now. So we can take a look at that, and I want to go there. I want to talk about what a society and a food system would look like to you on that end. But just before we leave that, I mean, there's also this other piece. People are really drawn to bread and grains and some of the glutamorphin and some of the other pieces to this puzzle that give it partially an addictive quality. So I want to look at that quickly before we go on, because you see people have a real big challenge giving up the cheese, giving up the bread. And so I'd love for you to just punch into the science on that quickly, and then let's start talking macro and talking about what we can do to shop differently.
Yeah, there are a number of different morphine-like protein compounds found in grain and dairy that actually can create an addictive scenario. So a person could, just like you have an alcoholic who has a really hard time putting the drink down, or cigarette smoker has a really hard time. You can create. Some people have a reaction to grain much in that same addictive way. In essence, it's a morphine being a protein that makes you feel good, it makes you happy, and so some people get their feel good and they're happy from consumption of food, and particularly grain and dairy. And so when you take those things away, in essence, in their mind, you're taking away their happy. At least they're short-term happy. They get a quick fix before the next quick fix, right? And they find themselves in that fixated cycle of, I need more and more and more. I need to continue to do it. But the very thing that I'm doing to get that fix is also the thing that's destroying my body. It's exactly the same in terms of a scenario as alcoholism. It's, the person, the functioning alcoholic is going to keep drinking. It gets him through the day, but on the inside, it's destroying his life. And that is the same type of scenario. So you've got, gluteomorphins, and there are different subfractions of these morphine-based proteins in gluten and grains. And then you've got caseomorphins, which are the same types of addictive proteins found in many of the dairy products. But then above and beyond that, since we're on the topic of dairy, one of the things that happens to dairy is, somebody will say, why are you talking about dairy? Dairy's gluten-free, isn't it? Well, yeah, technically it is gluten-free, although casein, the protein within dairy, can mimic gluten for many people. But then you have this aspect to dairy processing, which is when we take the proteins within dairy and we preserve them. We run this enzyme through the dairy to preserve the shelf life and extend the shelf life. It's called microbial transglutaminase, or MTG. And so when you do that, what happens is that enzyme acts on casein in such a manner that makes casein look more and more like gluten. So a person who is gluten sensitive has a similar reaction to processed dairy that they might have to strictly bread or gluten or any other of the grains. So you've got that aspect as well.
It's nuts. And those two together are pretty much the staples of Western diet. And so how do we got to look at this in terms of food systems, in terms of agriculture? I mean, what would your solution look like if you were to be able to wave a wand and say, we're going to change the way we grow food? Are we talking vegetables all around with minimal grains, no grains? How does it look for you?
Well, I think it looks unique in this sense. In society, and government has a role in that. That role is to serve the greater good, right? And in serving the greater good, sometimes the people who are not, certain segments of the population aren't being served well. And so a perfect example of this is, the food guide pyramid. Originally developed, the food guide pyramid said eat 8 to 10 servings of grain a day. Had nothing to do with science, had nothing to do with anything other than the USDA wanted to support, United States Department of Agriculture wanted to support agriculture. Right? Fundamentally, that's their job. It's not a scientific food guide pyramid. And most people don't realize that. And when they teach it in school, you indoctrinate children at a very early age to take that nutritional paradigm as gospel, as opposed to questioning it. So you have to work backwards, and you have to say, why are we recommending all this grain in the first place? And who is not well served? And we have to be able to have some way to identify those people. I personally like to do that through genetic testing, because when I know what a person's genotypical pattern is to react to gluten or not to react to gluten, I can then give them very specific information for them as a unique person, as opposed to creating a generalized guideline that leads to, one of the worst healthcare systems in the world. I truly believe if you had grain out of the food supply and processed dairy out of the food supply, I believe that a vast majority of the health issues that people in the United States and other industrialized nations face would start to go away. The well would dry up, and we'd spend so much less in medical, medications and surgeries and other types of, we get people to such a sick point that now intervention is the only way, unless we have doctors trained, and we don't at this point. We don't have enough doctors trained to teach about nutrition. As the average medical doctor goes through school and learns a hell of a lot about pharmacological properties and actions of medications, but the average doctor learns less than 7 hours, gets less than 7 hours of nutritional education. People don't know that, and so they assume that doctors' advice on nutrition is very sound, when in fact Well, it's like going to the guy under the bridge to get your advice about how to manage your money. You know, the guy doesn't know anything about how to manage money. He's living under a bridge. Well, the doctor doesn't know a whole lot about nutrition. He really hasn't studied it to that great degree. But if you need a medication, he studied that extremely well. So I think one, we have to identify where, at what interjection point within our society, where do we need to make changes so that we bring about long-term changes? Because this isn't a quick fix. You can't just make grain go away. It's not going to happen. So you got to start in school. You got to start with the principle of functional medicine and biochemical individuality. And I think that needs to be taught in school so that children can learn at an early age that they're unique in their own internal biochemistry, their own genetics are going to interact with their environment to bring about their phenotypic expression, their health, so to speak. And you have to start with that fundamental premise so that you know that there's no one-size-fits-all platform that any government can take on. I think when we try to force one-size-fits-all, we always find out there's a problem with that. And oftentimes it's a very costly problem after many, many years. And at that point, we've got these indoctrinated beliefs that are hard to work around and hard to go away. Just look how long it's taken for gluten to show up in mainstream. You know, I've been practicing 15 years, and I'm not the first doctor to talk about gluten, and I won't be the last. But just in my career, when I first started in practice, you could go to the grocery store, and everybody was like, gluten what? There wasn't a gluten-free aisle. You know, nobody even really knew what it was. Today, it's a common household word. It's the fastest-growing diet ever in the history of man, and it's the fastest-growing diet for a reason. It's because it works. Right? When you apply it, it works. Even if you don't apply it 100% in the right direction, it still works. You still see, you know, big changes in people. So I know there's no perfect way to answer your question, but I go back and say, look, we've got to start teaching kids in school. We've got to start teaching people that they need to be responsible for the food that they're eating, and they need to get an education about the food that they're eating. As you probably followed, we've got all this GMO stuff now and these new laws that are trying to be passed that make it illegal for the government of states to regulate whether or not a product has to be labeled GMO. I mean, ultimately it's the person's responsibility eating the food. It's their responsibility to know where that food comes from. We have to have some degree of self-responsibility first, and we can't point fingers at other people. And I think it begins there. And so what does that look like? That looks like, well, if you can't get the food that you need, maybe you consider growing a garden. If you can't go to the grocery store and find organic, then maybe you consider putting some space aside in your yard, you know, and growing some seasonable things. And maybe you don't have time to do that. So maybe you join a co-op, right? An organic co-op where other people do the gardening for you and you pay them a fee. You know, maybe it's visiting the farmer's market. Maybe it's not so convenient as just going to the local grocery store to pick something up or driving through somewhere to pick up some food. So that part of the convenience aspect goes away, but I would trade health for convenience any day.
Well, that's the funny trade-off, because most people who are trading health or convenience for health are complaining about not having energy and not having time. And once you get your health back, then all of a sudden you're the person that's running around doing everything and feeling good about it. So it's this weird trap that we fall into, thinking that our circumstances would be worse off if we put more time into taking care of ourselves. And it's just a logical fallacy. A couple quick things is the individual, like personalized medicine. I mean, you and I can talk about that. It's just like, hell yeah, I love genetic testing. Sounds expensive, right? It sounds very gourmet. And so the other side of that is everyone's like, oh, what should I eat for this? Oh, I heard gluten's bad. Oh, I heard, you know, this is bad. And there's just these really kind of blanket health statements that are out there that are really inappropriate for all the reasons that you just said. It's just, you know, we are different and we respond differently, and we should understand that there is no one size fits all. But if I'm listening to this and, you know, money's tight and I'm trying to figure out what the heck to do and how I can interface with this information and do better, is a genetic test accessible? Like, can I go get genetic testing? Is that very expensive? Is there another way to do it? How do I go about even getting my foot in the door if I'm just trying to figure this stuff out?
So yeah, genetic testing is very accessible. It can be done with a cheek swab. We actually have it set up online. If a person really needs to go to that endeavor to figure out whether or not they need to cut grain out, that's highly what I would recommend is genetic testing. They can find that at glutenfreesociety.org. There's a big genetic button on the top of the website there. Um, it's affordable, and if we think about it, the cost is under $400 to get genetically tested. And I say it's affordable in this way. The number one cause of bankruptcy in the United States is medical expenditure, is medical bills. So if we maintain the current course of action, then 42% of all bankruptcies occur as a result of people who've lived their entire life working to get ahead, right? Destroying their health and wrecking their health in the process. And then they get to the end of their life, not the end of their life, but they get to the point where they're ready to retire and take that money they've worked so hard to generate to try to do fun and nice things. But now they're dealing with all these health issues. And that is right there, that 42% of bankruptcies is where we see it come from. I would say invest in yourself early on, just like you would invest in a growth stock mutual fund if you're trying to put away for retirement, or a Roth or a 401k or any of those types of things. You don't wait until you're 60 to start investing to put away. You put a little bit away all the time. You put a little bit away each paycheck. You put a little bit away and invest in it. And you would invest in your health much in the same way, is put a little bit of aside to invest in your own biochemical uniqueness so that you can figure out the different processes of what you need to do as a unique person to follow, and then you won't have the huge expenses. I had a patient on that note. I had a patient recently. She'd been to the emergency room 6 times prior to coming to see me, 6 times within a year span, to the tune of about $20,000 a visit.
Yep.
She had insurance, but her insurance didn't cover all of that, and I think she was out of pocket close to $60,000, which is a large sum of money. Within a month of changing her diet, we did genetic testing, we did biological testing to determine what she should and shouldn't eat. Within a month of changing her diet, she had no more headaches. After about a year of being on that diet, she had no more emergency room visits, and she was completely clear. I mean, so you take somebody in that scenario, the cost is definitely worth investing. And I think even if a person's not violently sick, wouldn't it be awesome if we could test kids at birth genetically and say, hey, look, let's not introduce you to these foods. Let's just go through life knowing those aren't the best things for you as a unique person, so you're better off leaving those alone. To me, that would save a lot of people a lot of grief.
Yeah, it seems like we're turning that corner, and the mark of a sophisticated society does stuff just like that, right? It's preventative, it's predictive, it's just good, solid medicine, and we're just coming through this better living through chemistry hangover where we just thought that there would be a pharmacological solution to all these problems, and there was a lot of hubris in that type of thinking, right? That one size fits all, like, I've got it. And so this transition period really is where we're seeing a lot of people just get mowed down and become, products of a broken medical model, and we're seeing it all over the place. The ER visits are all from, not all, obviously people get hit by buses, but a lot of the ER visits, a majority of the ER visits are due to some sort of chronic condition that is out of control, and that's from how you eat, that's how you live, it's all the stuff that functional medicine doctors have been talking about for a long time, and people are just so behind the stick that they're like, $400, I don't have $400. It's like, well, you've spent $60,000 here, and you just lost your job because you can't focus, and all the different things that come with this weird paternalistic model that is the health insurance or Medicare or state run health insurance models that make you think that you just do what you will and you're covered, right? And that's breaking because the deductible and the copays and all these things alone cost way more than it would to just eat healthy and have a better diet and do some prevention and predictions. So you're talking $400 up front, get some genetic testing, know how to steer clear of the icebergs, and at that point, just change your diet around and your body will start to bounce back, right?
Yeah, the body's a very intelligent and sentient thing. We absolutely know a lot less than what we think we do, right? The fundamental premise is, we don't know what we don't know. But we do know that the body has the ability to self-heal if we provide what it needs to do so. If we're providing our major staple food is not nourishing, but counter-nourishing, plus it's inflammatory, it's a really, really hard environment to ever get anybody to heal. And that's why I'm so adamant about a person knowing what that is for them. I've seen kids who were, actually I had a terminal case one time, young boy, he was allergic to gluten, or he had a gluten sensitivity. and he did really, really well just cutting out grain. But then he hit points where his knees, he had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. He hit points where his knees would swell up to the size of softballs. And we had a really hard time figuring that out. So we went back in and we did additional food testing. He was allergic to blueberries. And so every day he'd get a blueberry smoothie for breakfast, right? And that for him, that was the wrong thing to put in. And so when we cut that out, we saw the swelling come down. We saw the swelling go away. So it really is biochemical uniqueness. You can take a healthy food, and for some people, that healthy food is not going to be healthy. You can take healthy people who eat an unhealthy food long enough, and we like sugar and hydrogenated processed oils and things of that nature. Those are kind of what I would call common sense no-brainers in nutrition, right? At least I would hope that they would be. But cutting out broccoli or cutting out blueberries or cutting out beef or cutting out a particular food that we would consider to be healthy in an otherwise sick individual, sometimes that's where it's at. Sometimes that's where the recovery occurs, and it's really, really hard to do that when we live by dogmatic beliefs, and put everybody in the same box.
That's the challenge of civilization, right? The governments want to classify and put people in boxes, and people aren't boxable. I mean, we're just different. And a lot of this is, so if you have this gluten issue, so this kid's got a gluten sensitivity, he didn't know it, he grew up, eating Cocoa Puffs and, think no one could figure out why he's sick. You pull that out, but during that period, it seems like with the intestinal permeability, a chunk of blueberry could have gotten by, and the immune system says we're under attack, and then it rightfully, assigns antibodies to blueberries because they shouldn't be in the bloodstream in big clumps like that. And now, unfortunately, a very nice antioxidant, beautiful food that would otherwise be good for you had crossed over and has been tagged as dangerous by your immune system, and like it or not, you can't have it. That happens on the backside, or maybe there's a genetic predisposition on the front end, but either way, blueberries are wonderful except for this kid, and you would never have known.
Right, exactly.
So genetic testing sounds like a no-brainer, and it's something that is moving ahead. I think I've seen it fast-track in the last couple of years. There's a lot more genetic testing happening everywhere, and for good reason. It's just good, solid medicine. And then just in terms of what we can do to get the big bad poisons out, if grasses, which are grains, are the fundamental kind of staple of the food that humans have adopted, and the part of the husk that protects the seed is what we're eating, and that part of that husk is what is actually telling our digestive system to shut down, and it's also acting like a cloying agent. I mean, you mentioned to me that the mortar used in the Great Wall of China is gluten from what, rice, was it?
Yep. Yeah, rice gluten. Yeah.
I mean, that just if you're listening to this or watching this right now, just visualize that, right? So this thing that's the staple of civilization, we take the gluten of it and use that to create mortar for the Great Wall of China to keep the Mongol hordes out, right? And so this stuff is sticky. This stuff is, it's designed to be such, right? It's to protect a seed. You eat enough of it, you wonder why your body doesn't like it. I mean, I want to paint that visual real quickly so we get a better sense of what these foods are, because I have a feeling most people, present company included, don't go back to just kind of visualize what this is and take that times 100,000 dosage over several years of life and wonder why the body's having trouble moving it through.
Yeah, slow poison is the best kind because it's, well, if you're a poisoner, right? Because it's the hardest one to identify, and that's where we're at. We're at slow poison. That's where medicine is at. As you mentioned earlier, we have an acute care model. If somebody gets hit by a bus, there's no better model in the world than our acute care model. I mean, if I had an acute problem, I'd want to be in a hospital in the U.S. But for chronic degenerative disease, which is the top, you got cancer, you got heart disease, you got diabetes, you got obesity, you got stroke, you got autoimmune disease, which is higher than all of them, which goes unrecognized. It's all chronic degenerative. It's all lifestyle. It's all personalization. It's all what we need to change.
So what are the first couple things people can do? Give me 5 things people can do walking away from here that will start to take kind of big cuts out of this this pain that they're feeling, and where can they go from there? Like, what's the pathway to success?
The path, well, again, I'm going to give you very generalized, as we've just had a conversation that you can't generalize, but I'll give you general.
Don't eat blueberries. Bah, wrong.
So one is, I would say test yourself. If grain is something you shouldn't be eating, test and get it out. So we'll call that number one. Number two, you really need to, I like to follow, there's 3 cardinal rules of nutrition that I like to have my patients follow, and I'll call this number 2, but it's 3 subsets. And the first rule is you can't get healthy eating food that isn't, right? So you have to be intelligent in the thought process of what you are eating. 2, don't eat what you're allergic or intolerant to. And 3, if you feel bad when you eat it, regardless of what any test ever tells you, stop eating it. Listen to your body, right? So those 3 cardinal rules of nutrition is the second thing that I would apply. Third, we have to look at other lifestyle factors that play a role in the body's ability to recover. And some of the most important ones, in my opinion, one is sunshine. We've lived the last 100 years in fear of the sun, even though we've lived the last several 100,000 years in the sun flourishing. So I think common sense prevails. Don't stay out long enough to burn, but stay out long enough to get adequate and ample sources of sunshine so you can make vitamin D and melatonin and the other hormones that are important as a result of getting that exposure. 2, make sure you're getting adequate sleep. So many people work so hard and they go to bed too late and they wake up too early and they take caffeine as a side effect of all that to overstimulate their body into some form of energy action. So get adequate sleep at least between the hours of 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., preferably longer on both ends, but science shows that in that 4-hour time frame is when we spend the majority resetting our hormones and healing. So you want to at least have it in that time frame. 3, I would say look at what you're doing physically. Most people go to work for 8 hours a day, they sit. The human body's not designed for 8 hours of consecutive sitting. It's designed for motion. And we're 70% water, and I'm going to use an analogy. If a pool of water is stagnant, it festers. Well, your body is a pool of water. And if it's stagnant, it's going to fester too. You need to have action steps to get motion, to get movement back in. You don't have to go to CrossFit and work out. You don't have to become an Olympic weightlifter, but get moving. Find a sport, find something you love to do and take part in it and get back to being active again. What am I on, number 3 or 4?
I think that was 3, yeah.
Okay. So number 4, you said 4, right?
I said, give us as many as you think are appropriate. And sure, yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say that number 4 is you've got to look at your lifestyle and you've got to cope with what you have. So, ask yourself this fundamental question: do I hate my job? And if the answer is yes, you've got to face a really, really hard truth. You've got to find something that you can be more passionate about in life. I'm fortunate, as you are, we found something that we're very passionate about that we can do and we can make a living doing it. And it's a wonderful thing. And I think if everybody could find that purpose and that passion in their life, I think a lot of the stress, as the old saying goes, you never work a day in your whole life if you love what you do. And I firmly believe that if people had a greater degree of the ability to manage their environmental stress and their relationships around them and their job, then life would be much happier and they would smile more and they would laugh more and things would just be so much better because, as you know, laughter is one of the best forms of medicine. And then beyond that, I would say intelligently put filters in place. We live in a world that's more toxic than it was 100 years ago. Filter your air, filter your water. 2 very, very simple things that can be done for relatively little money, but put those things in place because it just reduces your body's burden from the environment. And the more things like that you can do, overall, the better your body's going to have the ability to adapt and to heal and to respond when you're chronically ill.
Love it. On that note, when you talked about stress and loving what you do, I was in a position where I was running this medical group and I'm running around, banging around, really stressed out, really, just kind of worked up over a model that I thought was just unjust. And so I'm in the sick care model and I'm like, I got to get the hell out of here. But if you're in something that you don't like and you're not passionate about, but you thought you were, and you originally, I went into that model to help people, but I was on the wrong side of it. And so all I did was make a micro adjustment and really kind of call out the injustices and really transform the way I interfaced with the model to then be able to help people not get into trouble. And so it's not like I went from physician to astronaut, but sometimes it's just a micro adjustment to really stand for what you believe in and to step into where your passion and your integrity and your work ethic can be aligned. And that would be enough to just do it. So, a lot of people are like, well, what would I do if I didn't, do taxes? It's like, well, there might be an adjustment to how you do what you do that will fundamentally shift everything. And we all know stress is it's so heavy. I mean, with a lot of the people that I've seen clinically, I mean, they're okay. They might even have these intolerances, but then they have a bankruptcy or a divorce or some just really big life event that pummels them. And then that's when their body loses their tolerance. And so, again, you got to look at all of it. But I think that this new perspective of looking at grains as what they are and then just kind of pushing out from there is refreshing, because we don't think about this stuff. Like, we don't even realize what food is a lot of times in our culture because we're busy, driving through, and getting it from a window. And taking a step back and just looking at the origin of food and where that is in our lives, I think it's a really refreshing way to look at this stuff and then kind of go out from there and decide what your lifestyle is going to be. Doc, you mentioned genetic testing. You gave us a URL. Can you give us that URL again, please?
Yeah, it's gluten-freesociety.org. And there's a link on top. It says genetic testing. Just follow the link.
gluten-freesociety.org. And I know that No Grain, No Pain is coming up in January, and we're going to introduce it to our audience. I love your perspective. I know you're one of the old school functional medicine docs. You were there before this stuff was cool, and you kicked around all those kind of inner circles because you got it very early on. And so if I had a hat on, I'd be taking it off to you right now. I commend you on your work. I love what you're doing. And if you're out there listening to this, check out Dr. Peter Osborne. He's awesome.
Thank you for that. And I tip my hat to you as well, because what you've been able to do and the people you've been able to help educate and reach is just wonderful. And I think your message speaks for itself.
Cheers, man. Well, thank you very much. And we'll put the link to the genetic testing and your upcoming book out there for audience to enjoy, and keep doing the good work.
Thanks, you too.